So, before the remake of It comes out this week, I figured I'd talk about the miniseries that came out back to the 90s before the remake comes out. So, enjoy. Hey, what's up, you guys? Film Fan 0599 here again, and today we're going to review It, the miniseries. So, the way I'm going to be reviewing It, the miniseries is first, I'm going to talk about Part 1 into detail, like give kind of a full review about Part 1. Then I'm going to give a full review about Part 2, and then I'm going to just give my overall thoughts on the miniseries. So, let's just jump right into it. Let's just talk about Part 1. So what Part 1 of this miniseries is basically about, it's about when this child named Georgie gets killed, and his brother Bill, they start, and a group of other kids, they start to see something. They start to see a weird, I guess you could say, kind of entity a bit, and they realize it's a killer clown named Pennywise. And they basically need to kind of stop this killer clown. So, what did I think of Part 1 of the miniseries? It's okay. Part 1's fine. It's alright. It's not terrible or anything. It's okay at best. What I think really the main issue with this is that I think it's very rushed. That's what my main issue is. They bypass so many things in this that I'm just like, you could focus a little bit more on this. And it feels so rushed. It really does. It feels so rushed. That's probably my biggest issue with this, is that it feels so rushed and really doesn't give any time to really develop the characters really that much. They just kind of rush through it. But let's get into my positives first for Part 1. And my positives are, first being, I do think the kid actors do a pretty good job, really, for the most part. I do really like them a lot. Especially the kid that plays Bill. He gives the best performance, I think, out of all the kids. I really enjoyed him. They were all really good, the kid that played Mike was good, just everyone did a pretty solid job. I thought everyone was great in the movie that were the kids. For the most part, really, they were really good. I thought they did a pretty solid job. The chemistry between all of the kids I thought were great. It definitely didn't feel like they had a friendship with each other, and that's what I like a lot. I do think they did really do a good job of that, of really showing that these kids have a friendship with each other, and they did a pretty solid job with that in Part 1, and I like that a lot. It really showed, they really do develop these characters really well to have a great friendship with each other. And I thought, there was some good chemistry there. I thought they did a good job with their bonding in this movie. I will say this, I do like the makeup with Pennywise. I do think they did a pretty solid job of really making, Tim Curry look unrecognizable. I do think the makeup of Pennywise was actually really good. I will say that. They did a really solid job with that and really made Tim Curry look unrecognizable. As for Pennywise himself, I'll get into that a little bit more later. But I did think they did a pretty solid job with that. I will say, they did do a pretty solid job with the makeup with Pennywise in this, and really made Tim Curry look unrecognizable. Some of the writing is pretty good. I will admit there was some writing that was pretty good. I do think there was some good dialogue for the characters and everything. Directing was very 50-50 with me. Some of the directing is really solid with this. I thought there were some pretty solid directing moments in this miniseries. In Part 1 of the miniseries, there were some very solid directing in Part 1. I thought they did a pretty solid job with it. Editing was pretty solid as well. Cinematography was, pretty 50-50, I'll say. And directing was good for the first 50. It was good. Then the other 50, I'll get a little bit more into later on. But and there were some interesting moments. There were some moments in that the pacing did do a pretty good job. Like, there were some interesting moments and some moments that caught my eye. I was like, okay, that's pretty interesting. but that's only really sometimes, to be honest. Now the negatives. The negatives are, first being, I do think the kid actors could sometimes be overreacting a little bit too much. Like, there's some times where they can overact just a tiny bit. But really the worst actor out of all the kid actors, I guess you can say, is the ones that play the bullies. They're absolutely over the top, and it's just, like, it's laughable to watch. Like, they're so over the top, and I just didn't enjoy them at all. Like, they were pretty bad, honestly. They were just really, really over the top. And there's some times where the actual main kid actors could really get a little bit too over the top and overreact a little bit too much. But that's only sometimes. And we also get with the adult actors as well. Because, like, in the beginning, because they keep on flashing back to, sometimes they'll flash back to them as kids and then flash back to them as adults. Like, you know, flash forward, I mean. And just, the adult actors were really terrible, and part 2 focuses them on a lot. That should probably give a hint of what I thought about part 2, but we'll get more into that once we talk about part 2. But, you know, they were really bad, honestly. Pennywise himself, this is another problem. Pennywise himself, he does nothing. He does absolutely nothing in this movie. Like, seriously, and he is not scary whatsoever. He just, Tim Curry did not give an intimidating presence to me. Because, you know, obviously I haven't seen the remake yet, but from the looks of the trailers, it really does seem like Bill Skarsgård really has a menacing presence to him. Tim Curry, however, in this does not seem like does not have a menacing presence to him at all. Like, seriously, there's nothing that I found menacing about Pennywise in this. He just kind of does nothing, really. He does absolutely nothing, and he was just kind of a mediocre villain to me, and just kind of a waste of what could have been a great villain for this, but they just kind of waste him, and Tim Curry doesn't do that great of a job to me. The movie can be corny as hell. Sometimes this, like, gets really, really corny. I don't use that term often, corny. And, man, does it get corny. Like, seriously, there's some moments in this that I'm just like, really? Like, it just gets really corny at some points during part 1. It really does. They sometimes have to use effects and whatever, and it just doesn't look good. Like, it really doesn't. There's sometimes where the effects just don't look that good to me, and it's just like, wow, that does not look good at all. Like, it just looks so bad. Some of the writing can be really just very mediocre to me. And like I said, with the other 50%, the directing, it really isn't that great. It's kind of just bleak looking. Like, it's very standard to me at times. Like, the directing could be really standard with this. At times during this miniseries, like during part 1, the directing could be really standard. And lastly, my final issue with part 1 is that it's very rushed. It really does rush through a lot of things that I think could have been explained a lot more. And they just rush through it. I'm like, why are you rushing through this? And they just rush through it so much. And that's probably my biggest problem with part 1, is that it rushes through a lot of things that could have been really interesting, but they decide to rush through it. And I'm glad that the remake is like over 2 hours, because maybe it will give us some more depth about these characters. Because with this, they just rush through a lot of things. I was just like, you know, why do you have to rush through it? Like, it felt very, very rushed to me. So overall, part 1 of the miniseries is okay. It's fine, it's alright, it has some good moments to it. I think the kid actors do a pretty good job, and they have some pretty good chemistry with it. But like I said, my main problems are that the acting can be a little bit over the top at times. Pennywise is just a waste of a villain in this, and it's really, really rushed. Those are probably my 3 biggest problems with it, and it's just an okay of part 1, honestly. So, as an official grade on part 1, I would give part 1 a C+. Yeah, part 1 is just okay. C+ is perfect for it. I'll give part 1 a C+. It's alright. It's fine. Not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it was just kind of forgettable and mediocre. So, yeah. So that's part 1. Now on to part 2. So what part 2 is basically about, part 2 is about the kids, now they're adults, and it's 27 years later, I believe, like 27 years, 30 years later, I think, right? I could be wrong, but, you know, it's been a long time since they were kids, and Pennywise has returned, and now they made a promise at the end of part 1 that they will all come back if Pennywise returned. So, what did I think of part 2? Wow, that was bad. Part 2 is, whoa, like, part 2 is god-awful. Like, seriously, part 2 is just, wow, part 2 is really bad. Part 2 is quite awful to me. I was baffled of how awful this was, because I've heard many things about part 2. I've heard how bad it gets. I did not expect it to be, like, this bad. Like, with each moment of this movie, it got worse and worse and worse. Like, part 2 is just absolutely terrible. So, let's get into my positives, because I do have positives with part 2. And the positives are, first being, the adult that plays Mike. I believe that's, you know, Tim Reed plays him. I believe that's the actor's name. He was the only good adult actor in this entire film. He was the only one that I thought was given at least a good performance in this, and it was the only one, really, that was trying in this movie. He was really the only one that was good in this film, and I can safely say he really did give a good performance in this movie, and I did quite like him a lot. So yeah, he's really the only one out of any of the actors in this film that give a good performance. And my last positive is that there are some moments in this movie that are just so hilariously awful. Like, there's some moments in this film that are so bad that it's funny. Like, seriously, there were some moments where I was dying of laughter because of how bad it was. So, yeah, those are my only positives with part 2. So I might as well just jump straight into the negatives with part 2. And my negatives are, first being the acting. The acting is absolutely atrocious in this. Like, this has to be some of the worst acting I've ever seen in my life. In anything. The acting is so terrible in part 2. Remember how I said, you know, the adult actors were, like, really bad in part 1? Yeah, they're even worse in part 2. Oh my lord. Richard Thomas as Bill is awful. Wow. He does such an awful job in this movie that, wow, like his dialogue and, like, he's just terrible. He does such an awful job. He's not capable of acting in this. And, like, Bill has a stutter. And I thought the kid, you know, that played Bill in part 1 did a really good job with this, with the stutter. I thought he did a pretty solid job with this. With Richard Thomas in part 2, it just was like, it was just so, like, laughable how he would do the stutter in this. Like, I was just like, are you not even capable of, like, doing a stutter? Like, are you that terrible of an actor? Like, seriously, he was so bad. Like, he might have been, like, oh, it's actually tough to say who was the worst out of anybody in this movie. Oh, man, John Ritter. John Ritter's in this. And I love John Ritter. John Ritter's a fantastic actor. But what was he doing, man? He was so bad as well. He didn't give a good performance either. And I love John Ritter. But what was he doing? Like, seriously. The woman that plays Beverly in this was so bad as well. Oh my goodness. Some of the lines she says in this movie. Oh my. Some of the worst dialogue I've ever heard in my life. Just everyone does such an awful job. All the adult actors are so terrible in this. They really are. They are so bad in part 2. Definitely some of the worst acting I've ever seen in my life. So bad. And, by the way, if you thought Pennywise did nothing in part 1, oh boy, he does even less in part 2. Seriously, he does even less in part 2. Like, he does absolutely nothing in part 2. Absolutely nothing. Like, seriously, he does absolutely nothing in part 2. And Tim Curry is still just fine. He's not that great as the character, honestly. He really doesn't give a menacing presence to me. Like, I'm supposed to, you know, feel scared by this guy, and I don't. I just feel like he's, well, a joke. He's just not that good. Like, he's not an intimidating force at all to me. And just Tim Curry just doesn't do that great of a job to me. He's alright at best. He's just a mediocre villain. And some of the stuff, this movie, like if I thought part 1 was corny, my God almighty, do they just amp it up to an 11 with part 2. Like, there's some stuff that happens in this movie that I'm just like, what am I watching? Like, I really was questioning what I was watching at points during this film, because it just gets so over the top and so corny that it's just like, how did this even get made? Like, it's so bad how corny and over the top this part 2 gets. Like, it's so over the top part 2. Like, beyond the point. Like, there's so many moments where they jump the shark with this that I'm just like, alright, okay. Like, they go off the rails with this. They really do. There's a moment that involved, I'll talk more about when I talk about the green screen, the visual effects, but a scene that involves a spider towards the end. Oh my lord. So, yeah. And I really, because at least with my, what I liked about part 1 is that at least the kids had chemistry with each other and everything. I don't feel that with part 2. I really don't feel like now them as adults, they don't have any chemistry with each other. Like with the kids, I felt like they had chemistry, but with the adult actors, I feel like they have no chemistry whatsoever with each other. Like seriously, it feels like they have no chemistry with each other. All the adult actors in part 2. Like seriously, they do not have, like, any chemistry with each other whatsoever. The writing is so atrocious with this. Oh my, it's some of the worst writing I've ever seen in my life. Like, the writing is so atrocious with part 2. Like, I absolutely hate the writing with part 2. The directing is so standard. Like, it's so standard. Like, it really is. Like, it's so bland and bleak, really. Like, it's so bland, the directing with this. Editing is alright. Cinematography is not good. Cinematography just feels so myth. Like, it's so bland, the cinematography with this. Like, the directing isn't even that good with part 2. At least there were some good directing moments in part 1, but part 2 just really doesn't have any good directing to it. Oh lord, the green screen and the visual effects with this are even worse than they are in part 1. Okay, I mentioned the spider earlier. For the Lord Almighty, for the sweet baby Jesus, okay? The green screen with this has to be some of the worst use of green screen I've ever seen in my life. It is so bad, and like this giant spider appears, and it's one of the most over-the-top things I've ever seen. Like, I was just baffled of how far this movie went. Like, it's so bad. The giant spider. It's so bad. That scene is the worst scene in the entire movie. It's so bad. And the movie moves at a snail's pace. You know, when I felt, you know, part 1 rushed, part 2 just drags on. Part 2 drags on forever. It feels like it's never gonna end, part 2. Like, I was just like, just end already. When it did end, I was like, thank you God, it's over. Like, it drags on forever, part 2. You feel like it's never gonna end. Like, seriously, it drags on so much. So part 2, overall, part 2 is pretty awful. Part 2 is, like, worse than I heard it was. Like, this went beyond my expectations for how awful this was going to be. Part 2 is, like, just, my God almighty, is it awful. So, as an official grade for part 2, I would give part 2 a D. Part 2 is really bad. It's really terrible. It seriously is. Like, how they just, wow. From the atrocious acting to Pennywise just doing nothing to the horrible writing, you know, just the over-the-top corniness of this all, and the fact that it moves at a snail's pace, everything, mostly everything about this is just god-awful. And I absolutely hated part 2. Part 2 is absolute garbage. And it definitely deserves a D. It's pretty bad. So, for the mini-series overall, I will say the mini-series overall is just alright. It's, you know, it's fine. It doesn't hold up, really. It's just so corny and so over the top that I find it hard to take it seriously. It's not that good to me. part one's alright, part two is just absolute garbage. So, just overall as a miniseries, it was fine, it was okay. I'm glad that they are remaking this because there is potential that they could do with this story, and I felt like it just wasn't that executed very well in this miniseries, and it's just fine. So it's time for my official grade on It the miniseries, and my official grade on It the miniseries is a C minus. Like I said, it's fine. It's okay as a miniseries. There are some good things with the miniseries that I liked a lot, but just the negatives outweigh the positives with this. They really do. Just It the miniseries was alright. It wasn't like, it's not good. It really isn't. It's just so over the top and so corny as hell that I find it way too hard to take it seriously. It's not that good. I didn't really enjoy all of that much, so it gets a C minus. So if you have seen It the miniseries, what did you think of it? Leave in the comment section below, and I'm FilmFan0599, and we will see you all later. Peace.